I work for Chr Hansen. Chr Hansen has been collaborating with Gusmer for over 10 years for bio-ingredients. I don't know how familiar you are with Chr Hansen. Chr Hansen is a global bioscience company. We are probably the biggest producer of bacteria cultures in the world, and 90% of all those bacteria cultures end up in your dairy products. 10% goes in meat and in cheese and in health products. I'm here today together with Hentie Swiegers. Hentie is our R&D innovation director, and I myself, I take care of the commercial side of the wine business. So a little bit about the non-Saccharomyces yeast today. This is not what. First, I want to share a little bit with you the achievements we've had over the years with ingredients for wine. Chr Hansen has been around, and all these products have been introduced also to the American market. I think in the 80s we introduced Viniflora, the first direct inoculation cultures for malolactic fermentation. And that was followed by a whole list of, let's say, products related to non-Saccharomyces yeast. The Prelude, the Fruitsen, and the Concerto. And then in 2011, we added to the range a new bacteria strain, which is Cine, which is a citrate negative strain, mainly for the malolactic fermentation of white wines and fruity red wines. Now we're working on a new concept which is called Nova, which is a different bacterial strain, and that's for malolactic fermentation. Try to do that before the alcoholic fermentation already. So then you would be finishing your product, you can stabilize your wine once the alcoholic fermentation is finished. US approval is pending for this product. You work under different rules than the rest of the world for your approval of ingredients. So we're working on this one. And we still have a full pipeline of innovations to hit the markets within the next few years. Just, again, something we're quite proud of. Last year we were awarded with the Frost & Sullivan Award for Innovation and Leadership within the wine. And this year we are the only party from the industry taking part and actually taking a leading part in a project that's called Micro Wine. Now Micro Wine is a big EU project looking at the genome of the micro ingredients, micro processes of what's all going on in wine. The grant involved with that is about 5 million euros, and we are in the process of employing 15 PhD students to look into that. So just to show you that there's a lot of focus from, let's say, governmental level to know more about what's going on in the wine. Where are we as Chr Hansen? At first, we are fermentation experts. We're not winemakers. You are the winemakers. And it is our objective to create tools for the winemakers with which they can make their own wines and improve the wines. And we're working in two fields of fermentation. It's the fermentation of the must with the non-Saccharomyces yeast, and we work with the malolactic bacteria. We are hardly present in the middle where Saccharomyces yeast, because as far as I understand, there's about 300 on the market already. That should be enough. So we work in those fields as fermentation specialists. Now, what we're going to talk today about is how you can combine all those tools in something which is called bioprotection. What can you do with microorganisms to improve the bioprotection of your wine? Now, what do we mean with bioprotection? That's more or less when you have a high concentration of well-identified and living microorganisms that can be used instead of preservatives. Yeah? That's a demand that's driven by consumer demand, and that's to avoid spoilage microorganisms in the wine. Those spoilage microorganisms are a very costly factor in the wine industry. My background is more within the dairy. I've been working in the dairy, and if there, as a quality manager, you would have a downgrading or loss of quality of more than 0.5%, you would be fired. Well, in the wine industry, bad ferments leading to downgrading of wine of between 8 and 15% of the production is not unheard of. Now, if with managing the fermentation part of the winemaking process better, you can reduce this downgrading. There's a lot of money to be saved for the industry, which is going to be very important in the near future. Here are 3 examples already of existing types of bioprotection. The first, of course, is the use of Saccharomyces strain, just to produce alcohol. Without alcohol, no wine. The second one is an Unococcus uni strain, where you can manage the malolactic fermentation, but at the same time suppress undesirable lactic acid bacteria and other products like, for instance, Brettanomyces. And the last one, that's what we're working on now, is where you use a non-Saccharomyces species like a Spora at the maceration phase to outcompete unwanted wild yeast and molds. Yeah? There's two types to look at bioprotection, two ways. The first one is the compound production, again like your alcohol. We are again more on the other side where it comes to competitive exclusion. And with competitive exclusion, what is important is that you know the strains, you have identified the strains very well. The concentration of the active cells in the medium, which is wine, which for a lot of microorganisms is quite a hostile environment, and the growth rate of the strain. Now the bioprotection comes from the Jameson effect. I don't know whether you are familiar with the Jameson effect, but more or less it looks at the relationship between a protective culture, which will grow in your wine in the liquid phase. And if you compare that to the growth of a contaminant, which hopefully will start at a lower level than your inoculation rate, if you use them together, you will see that the inoculated species will avoid contaminants to grow. So there is competition in the medium to make sure that they don't grow. Okay. Now it's all very nice to talk about bioprotection, but at the end of it, it has to create some value. Without value, it's meaningless. Now, how can we create the first value, which is consumer benefits? First thing that the consumer is looking for, and not only in wine, is cleaner recipes. What can you do with bioprotection to make cleaner recipes? Is a reduction of your sulfates. Is a reduction of your preservatives, and also a reduction of negative compounds in your wine. All in all, a more safe product. This should create, again, something like brand love. The consumer of wine is changing. I don't know if any of you has been to one of those big parties, those wine events in New York and Chicago. They're loud, there's a lot of music going on, it's wild, it's completely different than 10 years ago. Now, what is Generation X looking for when they start consuming wine? It's consistency, that they know when they look at the bottle what to expect. It's also looking at sustainability. Yesterday we were in Lodi, and there the use of water is extremely important. And if you can reduce that water usage by, let's say, a unit of quality, it's a big part of your benefit. And the last one is health. Everybody is looking at reduced alcohol within the wine, but something which is also very important is biogenic amines. Now, I don't know, are you familiar with biogenic amines in wine? Is that something that's already... Biogenic amines are in principle the precursor for histamine, histidine, allergens in wine. And a lot of people who react to wine drinking get headaches, red faces and so on. That is a reaction to biogenic amines. Yeah? Most of the biogenic amines enter the wine either via the grape or via malolactic fermentation if it's not controlled very well. So you have the means at the moment to control this, for instance with using bacteria. I can guarantee you that within the next 10 years there will be a huge consumer debate, and also where the legislation comes in, on health and biogenic amines. It's already started in Europe, and it will more or less spread the rest of the world as well. And just for you to think about, your wine that you produce today will be consumed in 5 to 10 years from now. If you don't start looking and thinking about your biogenic amines already now, what will that do to your stock value in 5 years if you find out there's too many biogenic amines in it? So it's definitely something to talk to your people about and say, okay, is there anything we can do? This creates value. Now these are the things which are probably more interesting for the commercial people in your winery. So please share this with them as soon as you start those processes, that these are benefits that they can use in the field when they try to sell the wine to the retailers. On your side, what can you do with it? It's more to build margins. Now, how can you build margins with the processes? It's first of all, look at the grape potential. Yeah? 90% of the quality from the wine comes from the grape. Yeah? The best you can do in a winery is preserve that quality. You can't improve on it. Now, better make sure you do that, and fermentation of course, plays an extremely important role in that. So the grape potential, if you look at management of fermentation, you minimize the risk of defects and you bring out the true potential of your grapes. And on the other side, your fermentation management, if you control both, you look at the biosafety, but you also start to add full traceability of ingredients to your processes. Again, something which is driven by retail, they want to have traceability of ingredients. So this is how you can start with grape potential, fermentation management, cleaner recipes, brand love. And it is there already. There are wines who are working with no detectable sulfates. I've been talking to the purchase group in Sweden, Systembolaget. They are, after Walmart, the biggest buyer of wines in the world because they buy for a whole country. And they are definitely looking at reduction of sulfates. They're also looking at control of biogenic amines. And this wine is the first wine that actively promotes low levels of histamine or allergens in wine. So whether we like it or not, this discussion will come to us in the near future. Now, you've done a lot of work already in the wine industry. There's no bad wine on the market anymore. Now, how did you manage to do that over the time? So when you look at quality and time, is that it's an incremental improvement of quality. And the first step is your yield control. The second step is probably the introduction of commercial yeast to make better wines. And that started in the US. I think in the 60s, Gallo was the first one to use commercial yeast. Now it's temperature control, and I hope that you as winemakers manage this already well. So what are we looking at today to improve the overall quality of the wines further? Is more or less we're looking at malolactic fermentation and the non-Saccharomyces yeast. Yeah? This is based upon functionality, security, and economy of these products. Hentie will come back in more detail on the functionality of these products, and mainly of the non-Saccharomyces yeast. But again, if you look at tomorrow, what the consumers is looking for is sustainability. And also there, these processes come in very handy. Because if you do biosafety, if you control that, it will have a health benefit in the near future. If you look at your better process control, you might be able to reduce your waste. If you look at your speed of fermentation, you will be able to affect your carbon emission. All these things will support the strength of the brand that you're putting out in the market. So this is a little bit from the commercial side. Hentie is going to take over from me now on the functionality of the non-Saccharomyces yeast.
Right.
All right?
Right. So as Ad introduced me, I'm heading up the innovation in Chr Hansen on wine. I've been working in microbiology for 20 years and the last 15 years in wine-related microbiology. I've put up a picture here, a microscopic picture of one of our strains. It's called Pichia cleveri. For those of you who've looked under a microscope at Saccharomyces yeast, you will notice that they look very different. The cells are very elongated, and in fact, they're very small. They're much smaller than Saccharomyces cells. So non-Saccharomyces yeast found in wine are very different to Saccharomyces, not only in the morphology, the way they look, the way they grow, but especially in the biochemistry, in the metabolites it produce. And what I would like to point out in the presentation is the strains that we have on the market today, what makes them unique. Because in many cases, these strains can produce metabolites that Saccharomyces can't. And they have effects that we will not see with Saccharomyces. So there's a huge amount of potential in this yeast. And slowly but surely, through science, wine science, research, investigations, work in the industry, we're discovering the capabilities of these yeast. So the idea of using non-Saccharomyces yeast in the wine industry, I discovered, is actually much older than I thought. I discovered this while working at the Australian Wine Research Institute a couple of years back. And there, in fact, there was a guy, Dr. Bryce Rankin. He was actually promoting the use of Cleveromyces thermotolerans, which was then called Saccharomyces veronii, in the late 40s. He provided this yeast to the winemakers on a slant, and they propagated and applied it in winemaking for a very specific reason. Then in the 1970s, German guy, Rainer Eschenbruch, he deposited a strain of Torilla spora del Bruchii, Saccharomyces rosé, it was called then. And he promoted this, again, using slants to the winemakers for sweet wines, also for a very specific reason. The commercial use of non-Saccharomyces yeast, as Ad mentioned, that was done by our company, Chr Hansen. And as you can see, we also introduced the concept using the Cleveromyces thermotolerans and the Torilla spora del Bruchii yeast. Not the same strains as in the AWI at the Australian Wine Institute, different strains, but similar properties. The first product was a blend of these two non-Saccharomyces yeast in combination with Saccharomyces. We then followed by launching single strains for very specific reasons I will go into a bit later. But in summary, it would be to give the winemaker more flexibility. So we launched a single strain of Torilla spora del Bruchii in 2009. After that, we launched Pichia cluveri in 2010. And you will notice that it's in a frozen format. And the reason for that is that up until today, we have not been successful in producing it in a dry format. And that's one of the challenges with non-Saccharomyces yeast. They're very difficult to produce. They're not as straightforward as producing Saccharomyces. There's a lot of knowledge on production of Saccharomyces. When it comes to non-Saccharomyces yeast, it's not that easy. And I believe that is one of the reasons why we haven't seen the use of these strains in the industry earlier, even though scientists and winemakers even have discovered their benefits quite some time ago. So we drew strongly on our fermentation capabilities and competences. We've been involved in fermenting and producing microorganisms for 150 years. And using our knowledge, we were successful in producing these non-Saccharomyces yeast and in a position then to provide them back to the winemakers so they could extract the value of the yeast for their wine. And then lastly, we introduced a single strain of Cleveromyces thermotolerans in 2012, and this was an active dried form. So over the last 50 years, there has in fact been a lot of interest from the wine science community in studying and understanding the population of non-Saccharomyces yeast in wine and what effects they have in wine and what way we can apply them. And today, on average, you will find more than 300 publications every year on this topic of various non-Saccharomyces yeast and the effects in wine. So a topic of great interest, both in the scientific community, but today also in the industry. So what is this non-Saccharomyces thing all about? So here is one example from a publication from Dr. Matt Goddard in New Zealand. Matt, in fact, isolated the Pichia cluveri strain, which we commercialized. And in this study, what he was interested in is looking at the ecology of microorganisms during spontaneous alcoholic fermentation. So this was a barrel fermented Chardonnay. And And the first thing you will notice is that the formation of alcohol, it takes some time before it actually starts fermenting. And that makes sense. There's no inoculation, the yeast have to grow up, etc. What you will also notice is the population of non-Saccharomyces yeast, represented in the dotted lines, and the CFU represented on that axis, develops in the early stages of this spontaneous malolactic fermentation. And thereafter, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast, represented in the solid lines, takes over the ferment, drives the alcoholic, etc. So this is the way it happens in nature in all cases. And this is the way wine has been made for thousands of years until we came with pure strains of Saccharomyces. So what happens then? If you inoculate a very high concentration of Saccharomyces, you dominate the population, and you do not really allow these non-Saccharomyces yeast to express their characters in the wine. So what we did was screen the strains in this area, pick the best ones, produce it, and now the winemaker can inoculate at a really high level, extract the value from the yeast, but still have the consistency that is required in modern winemaking. So when you look at the ecology of non-Saccharomyces yeast in wine, it is quite diverse. And here I've listed some of the genera we find in wine fermentations. Not all of them are good. Of course, Brettanomyces, you don't want. Some of these non-Saccharomyces yeast, like Hansenula, can produce a lot of acetic acid, ethyl acetate. So the key is in the screening, to find the strains that result in benefits to the wine. And that is exactly what we did. Again, we used our expertise in microbiology. We did large-scale screenings using advanced equipment like these robotic systems where we could screen thousands of strains in a week, and resulted in the strains and the products we have today. So for the commercial strains we have today, what type of properties do they develop in wine? And this is summarized in this slide. And then I will go into more detail in the rest of the presentation. First of all, flavors. It is well known that a lot of the non-Saccharomyces yeast can produce flavors more than Saccharomyces. In some cases, they can produce flavors that Saccharomyces cannot produce, etc. But in general, these non-Saccharomyces yeast are quite powerful in their ability to develop flavors. In our case, the Chr Hansen, that was specifically isolated for its flavor boosting properties. I will get into more detail further on. Then some of these non-Saccharomyces yeast can produce acids that Saccharomyces yeast can't produce. The example here is the Cleveromyces. It can produce lactic acid from sugars, which a Saccharomyces yeast cannot. Cleveromyces thermotolerance, the name, in fact, has changed the last year or two ago. And now it's called Lachantia. But for simplicity's sake and to avoid confusion, we stick with Cleveromyces thermotolerance. Then there are non-Saccharomyces yeast that can produce significantly more manoproteins than Saccharomyces yeast. And the example we have there is the Torula sporedelbrueckii. So let's start with the Chr Hansen, the fruitin. I mentioned it was isolated in New Zealand. It was the result of a long study by Auckland University, funded by the New Zealand wine industry. And what they were interested in was to find non-Saccharomyces yeast that enhance the flavor and aroma of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And the outcome was this Chr Hansen strain. The focus was volatile thiols, which I will get to in the next slide, but just to point out again, as I mentioned before, it's a frozen yeast. Primarily, the aim was to produce a yeast in active form because we couldn't produce it dried. So the frozen form is a technology we developed. The side benefit is that you can inoculate it directly. It's hydrated, not dehydrated like the active dried yeast, so you do not need to hydrate it. So we received the strain, we developed the technology to produce the strain, and this was the trial with the first prototype product. So we went back to New Zealand, where all the research was conducted. And we did the trials, we measured the thiols, 3MH and 3MHA. These are very potent flavor compounds in nanogram quantities, so very low concentrations, but very potent. You don't need much of this compound to have an impact in the wine. It has passion fruit, tropical flavors. In the control, these thiols were produced, quite high amounts. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is known to have a lot of thiols. When we inoculated the Pichia together with the Saccharomyces in this co-inoculation, we saw the increase in volatile thiols as expected, as the research indicated. So that was a very good confirmation. And then when we did a sequential inoculation, in other words, we inoculated the Pichia cluvari, we waited 48 hours, and then inoculated Saccharomyces. Then we saw an increase in the volatile thiols, but a much bigger increase. And that makes a lot of sense. Because what we did is gave the Pichia cluvari more time on its own to work on the flavor precursors and develop these volatile thiols before adding the Saccharomyces, which will then, as I showed before, dominate the ferment and lessen the effect of the non-Saccharomyces yeast. So it makes a lot of sense. We've been working with this product for some years now, and we have many different examples. This example is from France, Sancerre. Product is becoming very popular there in Sauvignon Blanc. And again, to show you that we continue to confirm this characteristic of the Pichia cluvari to increase the thiols in red. You will see that the thiols are not as high as they are in New Zealand, but they are still present, and the Pichia results in an increase in these thiols. The effect on the sensory is increase in mango flavors, pineapple, peach. These blue bars are the trials with the Pichia. So general increase in fruitiness. Quite different to New Zealand. They don't have as much thiols. In New Zealand, it's very passion fruit driven. Here, it's different types of fruit and some tropical. But overall, we confirmed the increase in thiols, confirmed the sensory effect on the fruit flavors. Recently, we've been looking at red wines, in particular Pinot Noir. And this trial was a trial we did last year in Chile on Pinot Noir. And again, we could see an increase in the volatile thiols, the 3MH. Now, the volatile thiols are not as abundant in red wines as they are in whites, especially Sauvignon Blanc. Much lower concentrations, as you can see, but they're still there, and they still have an impact. What's interesting about volatile thiols in red wine are that they don't necessarily produce this passion fruit character, but in fact black currant. So black currant is a very distinct characteristic of volatile thiols in red wines. And we could confirm using a formal sensory panel that when you use the fruitsen in the red, you get a spike in this black currant flavor. So to summarize, the application focused a lot is on white wines, Sauvignon Blanc. Also works really well in Chardonnay, unwooded Chardonnays, where you're looking for more flavor, easy drinking wines. We're starting to look at red wines, in particular Pinot Noir, and works also really well in fruit-forward rosé wines. So that brings me to the next yeast. So the Torulaspora delbrueckii. What makes this yeast unique? I mentioned that in that second slide of mine that this yeast was already promoted in the 70s for use on sweet wines. So what is the reason for that? Well, firstly, the scientific literature has shown, and we have seen it as well, both anecdotally and analytically, that the Torulaspora delbrueckii from the non-Saccharomyces yeast that we've and scientists have investigated so far produce significantly more manoproteins than Saccharomyces yeast. So this is very small print, but I'll just highlight for you the results. So here we have the Saccharomyces, and the researchers played with different concentrations or inoculation levels of Saccharomyces from 10 to the 7 down to 10 to the 3. When you co-inoculate with the Torulaspora delbrueckii, you increase the concentration of manoproteins at least double and up to 3 times. So it's very clear. The other interesting aspect of this paper, and we haven't done this in industry, but you can see when you reduce the inoculation level of Saccharomyces, you increase the effect of the non-Saccharomyces yeast. So there are 3 ways in which you can increase the effect of a non-Saccharomyces yeast. I've shown with a peak here, you need to give it more time. So the more time it has alone or without the influence of Saccharomyces, the more it affects the wine in a positive way. The other would be to reduce the concentration of Saccharomyces, then it is, again, has more of a chance to express its capabilities. In some cases, even the best when the Torulaspora is used by itself. I'll get to that later on, but for now, at least in this work, it was to reduce the concentration. And then, of course, if you increase the dose of the non-Saccharomyces yeast. So the key is to give it as much time as possible to express its characters. The other key characteristic, and this brings us to the sweet wines, is that the Torulaspora produces much less acetic acid, VA, especially in high sugar must. So what happens if you inoculate a Saccharomyces in a high sugar must? The yeast undergoes what we call osmotic stress. There's a lot of osmotic pressure in a high sugar must. And as a consequence, the Saccharomyces yeast will start producing acetic acid as a way to deal with the stress response. The Torulaspora delbrueckii is what we call osmotolerant. So it's much more osmotolerant than Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It does not have this very big osmotic stress in high sugar must, and consequently produces much less acetic acid. Another consequence of it being more stress resistant is that it produces much less medium chain fatty acids. These acids are extremely important to us and to winemakers, as they can inhibit and in some cases actually kill malolactic bacteria. So often when you have a stuck malolactic fermentation, it is a result of high concentration of these medium chain fatty acids, and in most cases these are caused by stressed yeast. Then the Torulaspora also produces more esters than Saccharomyces, generally resulting in black fruit characters, which I'll get to a bit later. We have many examples and trials with this yeast, but just to point out, when you use the Torulaspora delbrueckii, you always get this increase in what is described here as palate weight. So palate weight, mouthfeel, fullness, etc. So today, mostly used for reds, increase the body fullness, get some of that black fruit flavors. Can also be used for white wine Chardonnays. If you want a fuller Chardonnay, that's a very good yeast to use. Then we get to the Cleveromyces. So referring back to that first slide, where Bryce Rankin in Australia was promoting this yeast. Why did he do that? In Australia, you have very high pH, very low acid. In those days, they didn't add tartaric acid to their wines. And this was a very good way to increase the acidity of the must. The reason being the Cleveromyces can produce lactic acid. And this has been proven in scientific literature, again, by the same group, Comatini et al. In Italy. Same experiment, you have the Saccharomyces in different inoculation levels. Then you have the Cleveromyces, co-inoculate with the Saccharomyces. And you get up to, can get up to a 2 gram per liter increase in total acidity. This depends greatly on how you apply the yeast. In their case, they could only see a very big increase when the Saccharomyces level of inoculation was very low, 10 to the 3. So that's 1,000 cells per mil. Normally we inoculate it at 1,000,000 cells per mil. When they used sort of normal Saccharomyces inoculation, the increase was quite small. So again, it's quite obvious that to get a bigger effect with this non-Saccharomyces yeast, you have to play with the inoculation levels, time, etc. One of the consequences of producing lactic acid at the early stage of alcoholic fermentation is that you also increase the concentration of an ester, a flavor compound called ethyl lactate. So it's a volatile flavor compound. It has a fruity, strawberry-like character. And very simply, you have lactic acid and ethanol, which is converted by yeast into ethyl lactate. So it can be the Cleveromyces, it can be the Saccharomyces, other yeast. So in general, you get an increase in ethyl lactate when you use Cleveromyces. And we've shown this many times. This is one example. Trial we recently did in France on Merlot. And when you use the Cleveromyces, you always get the most ethyl lactate. And these wines are actually presented here today. And I'll explain a bit about them at the end of my presentation. So let's discuss a bit when to inoculate your Saccharomyces, because for the moment, this is what we recommend. So on average, it's around 48 hours after inoculation of your non-Saccharomyces yeast, especially with the Pichia clevari, the fruit sin. The Pichia clevari is not a very strong fermenter. When you inoculate it, you won't see much of a decrease in sugar. Most likely, you'll see the effect of the flavor a day, 2 after you inoculate it, a very big increase in the fruit flavor of the must, but not really a great decrease in sugar. The Cansado, Cleveromyces, and the Prelude, the Torulaspora, they actually quite strong fermenters for non-Saccharomyces yeast. In general, non-Saccharomyces yeast are not as strong fermenters as Saccharomyces, but these two are actually not bad for a non-Saccharomyces yeast. But there as well, we would recommend not more than 48 hours, and you will see a decrease in sugars. So for Cansado, very good for fruit-driven red wines. In the whites, it brings this sort of mineral-like character, most likely due to production of some lactic acid. So the final yeast product that I would like to give you more detail on is a product called Melody. It's a blend of Saccharomyces, Torulaspora, and Cleveromyces. So 60% Saccharomyces, 20% Torulaspora, and 20% Cleveromyces. Now this yeast has been, or combination of yeasts have been proven to be very good for Chardonnay. And it was in fact proven by the Australian Wine Research Institute, independent of us. There's a publication on this. You can easily find it on the web. It's publicly available. But the aim of this study was to see if we can use yeast to influence consumer preferences towards wine. So the wines were made with different commercial yeast, analyzed from a sensory chemical point of view, consumer testing were done, etc. So firstly, when you look at the sensory analysis, you can see that the melody was sort of driven to the tropical fruit flavors, also the viscosity, so production of manoproteins by the Torulaspora. The volatile thiols were measured. Chardonnay doesn't have a lot, but in this case it was a cool region, and there you get much more thiols in Chardonnay, in fact. And the most abundant one, 3MH, the melody was measured to have the most thiols corresponding to the tropical fruit characters. Then, when the consumer tasting was done, hundreds of consumers tasted these wines. This particular segment, which represented regular wine drinkers. Firstly, the winemakers had the wine tasters had different preferences, and in fact preferred the melody, and this was statistically significant. So very good study, proving that by just changing your microbiology in your winemaking, you can actually increase the preference of consumers towards your wine. So to give you a summary on the impact, the sensory impact of this yeast. So we did this trials in Spain. This is Bobal, Spanish variety, rosé. And as expected, when you use the fruitsen, the Pichia cluveri, you get the most fruitiness. When you use the cansado, the Saccharomyces, you get increase in acidity, you get the strawberry character. When you use the prelude, you get a fuller body, and also some of these dark fruits like black plum. In Cabernet Sauvignon, also in Spain, you get increased acidity, strawberry with cansado, fuller body with prelude. So again, confirming what we have seen. So what is new in the non-Saccharomyces yeast today? And that's not so much in new strains or new species that will come. But what's really a hot topic for the moment is using non-Saccharomyces yeast to reduce alcohol. Now, I've been involved in this type of research for many years, and scientists have been trying with Saccharomyces yeast, selection, mutagenesis, etc., for quite a significant amount of time to develop Saccharomyces yeast that can reduce alcohol. Up until today, there is no feasible solution. I believe the non-Saccharomyces yeast would be a very good future solution for this, to biologically reduce alcohol. So reducing alcohol in wine is quite simple. You have to move sugars to something else than alcohol. So this could be lactic acid, it could be manoproteins, it could be other compounds in wine, as long as they don't disturb the sensory balance of the wine. But either way, there's been a recent publication coming also from Australia showing that they could use non-Saccharomyces yeast to reduce the alcohol up to 2%. It was not industry trials, so really focused on laboratory, but they've proven their capabilities. In our experience, we see either similar production of alcohol or up to 0.5% less. We're still trying to understand when this is triggered, and this is why we're doing experiments like this. This is a laboratory experiment in sterile juice where we try and exclude other yeast. And firstly, what you can see is the Chloromyces, these two lines here, and the Torulaspora. they're actually not that bad in fermenting. You might remember in that second slide, they used to be called actually Saccharomyces, which means sugar-loving. So they are similar, but over time people have discovered, or scientists have discovered differences and therefore renamed them. The other aspect is that when you increase the dose, you increase the fermentation rate, both in the Torulaspora and in the Cleveromyces. This is the Saccharomyces up there. And then in this experiment, at least, we saw a 0.5% reduction in alcohol. We've done commercial trials in France, South Africa, and Australia with only fermenting high dose in non-Saccharomyces yeast with very good results. The wine you have in front of you is actually one of the experiments. So it's a French wine. It's from Bordeaux. It's a Merlot. And in this case, we got 0.5% reduction in alcohol with both cansado and the Torulaspora compared to the Saccharomyces. So finally, this is just to show that the non-Saccharomyces yeast could actually ferment dry and resulted in a wine of around about 12%. So today we don't have a specific recommendation. I'm in R&D, so we like to experiment and find out new things. But it's just to inform you about the new developments in non-Saccharomyces yeast. And we'll continue to research this topic, and hopefully we'll be back in a year or two with more concrete data and recommendations. So.